James, a hard-working black employee at one of the city's most prestigious corporations, was used to navigating subtle biases in his daily life. But nothing could have prepared him for the humiliation he faced one morning in the company parking lot. Standing in front of his car, he stared at the bright orange ticket on his windshield. Unauthorized parking, it read. The irony? The space he parked in was unmarked and routinely used by employees. Yet, as James watched his colleagues pass by without a second glance, he couldn't help but notice the uncomfortable truth: no one else was ticketed. "Why is it always us?" he muttered under his breath, clutching the ticket. What started as a frustrating morning would soon escalate into a battle for justice that would shake the entire company to its core. James had been an employee at Continental Enterprises for nearly 5 years, earning a reputation for his dedication and integrity. His days often began early, beating the morning rush, and this particular day was no different. He parked his car in the sprawling employee lot, in a space that had no designated markings, a common practice among employees when the primary spots were full. With his coffee in hand, James entered the building, unaware that his morning routine was about to be disrupted. Hours later, when he returned to the parking lot during lunch to grab his gym bag, a bright orange ticket flapped against his windshield. The words "unauthorized parking" glared at him under the midday sun. James looked around. Other cars parked in similar unmarked spaces had no tickets. Confusion gave way to irritation as he scanned the lot. "What's going on here?" he muttered. Spotting a security guard nearby, James approached with the ticket in hand. "Excuse me," he said politely. "Can you explain why I got this ticket?" The guard, a middle-aged man with a weary expression, glanced at the ticket. "You were parked in an unauthorized space," he replied curtly. "But this space isn't marked as restricted," James pointed out. "I've parked here before, and so have others. Why am I the only one ticketed?" The guard hesitated. "I just follow the orders I'm given," he said before walking away. James couldn't shake the feeling of unease as he sat at his desk, staring at the bright orange ticket that now lay on his keyboard. The words "unauthorized parking" seemed to mock him, reminding him of the morning's strange encounter. Every time he glanced at the ticket, a new wave of questions flooded his mind. He tapped his pen against the desk, debating whether to let it go or dig deeper. Maybe it's just a misunderstanding, he thought. But the more he reflected, the more inconsistencies he noticed. At lunch, James decided to mention the ticket to a few colleagues while they sat in the break room. The room buzzed with idle chatter, the sound of coffee machines humming in the background. "I got this parking ticket today," James began, holding up the slip for his coworkers to see. "But I've parked in that spot for months without an issue. And it's not even marked as reserved." Sarah, a friendly face from marketing, furrowed her brow. "That's odd. I parked in an unmarked spot this morning too, and I didn't get a ticket." Kevin, a longtime employee from IT, leaned back in his chair. "I park in those spaces all the time. Never had a problem," he said. James's eyes narrowed. "So why me?" he asked, half to himself. The room fell silent for a moment before Sarah offered hesitantly, "Do you think it could be? I mean, something else?" James knew what she was implying, but didn't want to jump to conclusions. "I don't know," he replied, his tone measured. "But it doesn't feel right." Determined to get answers, James spent the next few days quietly observing the parking lot. He arrived earlier than usual, noting where employees parked and how security handled different vehicles. His findings were subtle but undeniable. He watched as cars rolled into the same unmarked spaces he had used, their owners walking into the building without a second glance. He noted the security staff's indifferent glances at some vehicles while others, particularly his own, seemed to draw scrutiny. One morning, he decided to park in a different unmarked space, one closer to the building. By lunch, another ticket awaited him on his windshield. Frustration boiled beneath his calm exterior as he stood in the lot, holding the second ticket in his hand. "This isn't random," he muttered. That afternoon, James drafted an email to the head of security, carefully outlining his experience. He detailed the unmarked spaces, the inconsistency in ticketing, and his growing concerns about selective enforcement. He chose his words carefully, avoiding accusations but making it clear that he expected a response. The reply came quickly, but it did little to address his concerns. Parking in unmarked spaces is not permitted under company policy. Please ensure compliance to avoid further penalties. James read the email twice, his frustration mounting. That doesn't explain why others aren't being ticketed, he thought. Feeling stonewalled, he decided to speak directly with the security staff. Approaching the guard stationed at the entrance, James greeted him politely. "I was hoping you could clarify something for me about the parking policy," he began. The guard, who had been glancing at a clipboard, looked up briefly. "What do you need to know?" James held up the ticket. "I've been ticketed twice for parking in unmarked spaces, but I've noticed other cars in the same spaces without tickets. Can you explain why that might be?" The guard shifted uncomfortably, avoiding James's gaze. "I just follow the instructions I'm given," he said, his tone defensive. "And who gives those instructions?" James pressed gently. The guard hesitated before muttering, "The management." James thanked him and walked away, his suspicions deepening. The following day, James arrived early with a plan. Armed with his phone, he began documenting the parking lot. He took photos of unmarked spaces, the cars parked in them, and the absence of tickets on certain vehicles. By the end of the week, he had compiled a gallery of evidence that painted a clear picture. The enforcement of parking policies was anything but consistent. In the meantime, he shared his experience with a few more colleagues, including Rachel, a senior analyst known for her outspoken nature. "This doesn't surprise me," Rachel said, shaking her head. "I've seen things like this happen before. It's subtle, but it's real." She leaned closer, her voice lowering. "James, you need to speak up. This isn't just about parking tickets, it's about fairness." Her words struck a chord. That evening, James began drafting a more detailed email, this time addressed to HR. He attached his photos, outlined his observations, and requested an investigation into the matter. The next morning, whispers about James's situation began to circulate. "Did you hear about the parking tickets?" one coworker asked another in the break room. "It's strange, isn't it?" another replied. "I've parked in those spots for years without an issue." The story quickly gained traction, and more employees approached James to share their experiences. Some mentioned similar incidents, while others expressed their support. By the end of the week, James found himself at the center of a growing conversation about fairness and bias in the workplace. The parking lot tickets were just the spark. Now, employees were beginning to question other policies and practices within the company. James returned to his desk after lunch, still holding the second bright orange ticket he had received that morning. The repeated enforcement felt deliberate, and the email from the head of security offered no real answers. Something about this situation didn't add up, and James decided it was time to dig deeper. He pulled out his notebook and began jotting down the details of his experience so far, dates, times, locations, and the names of people he had spoken to. "If there's a pattern here," he thought, "I'll find it." The next day, James arrived even earlier than usual, determined to observe the parking lot before most employees arrived. He parked his car in a far corner of the unmarked section and sat quietly, watching as the lot began to fill up. He noticed familiar cars belonging to colleagues pulling into the same unmarked spaces he had used in the past. None of them received tickets. The security guard on duty seemed indifferent, occasionally glancing around but making no moves to enforce the so-called policy. James discreetly snapped photos with his phone, capturing the scene. As the day went on, he documented cars coming and going, noting which vehicles were left untouched and which received the dreaded orange tickets. By the end of the week, he had compiled a small portfolio of evidence. It was clear, the parking rules weren't being enforced consistently. Back in the office, James began having quiet conversations with his colleagues. He approached Sarah, the marketing associate, who had previously expressed confusion about the ticketing. Have you ever parked in those unmarked spaces? James asked her. All the time, Sarah replied. I've never gotten a ticket, though. Why? James hesitated before showing her the photos he'd taken. I've been keeping track, he said. And I think there's a pattern. It seems like certain cars are being targeted while others aren't. Sarah's eyes widened. Are you saying this is intentional? I'm not sure yet, James replied. But I can't ignore what I've seen. James's observations soon caught the attention of other colleagues. Kevin, the IT specialist, pulled James aside during a coffee break. I heard you've been documenting the parking lot, Kevin said. What have you found? James showed him the photos and explained his theory. It seems like the rules are being enforced selectively, he said. Kevin frowned. That's not right. Everyone should be treated the same. Encouraged by the support, James continued gathering evidence. He expanded his observations to include weekends and late evenings when the lot was less crowded. The pattern remained consistent. Certain cars were ticketed repeatedly, while others were left alone. With his findings in hand, James decided to escalate the issue. He drafted a detailed email to HR outlining his observations and attaching the photos he had taken. I believe there is a discrepancy in how parking policies are being enforced, he wrote. The evidence suggests a pattern that disproportionately affects certain employees. I request a formal investigation into this matter to ensure fairness. The response came 2 days later. Thank you for bringing this to our attention. We will review your concerns and respond shortly. Though the reply was vague, James felt a small sense of relief. At least the issue was now on record. Word of James's actions began to spread, sparking quiet discussions across departments. Employees started sharing their own experiences with inconsistent enforcement of rules, not just in the parking lot, but in other areas of the workplace as well. Rachel, a senior analyst, approached James in the hallway one afternoon. I've been hearing about what you're doing, she said. And I think you're onto something. This isn't just about parking tickets, it's about accountability. Rachel shared her own story of how she had once been reprimanded for a minor policy violation while her peers were let off with a warning. It's not always blatant, she said. But the bias is there, and it's time we call it out. Armed with Rachel's support and the growing awareness among his colleagues, James decided to follow up with HR. He scheduled a meeting with Lisa, the HR representative who had responded to his email. During the meeting, James presented his evidence, including the photos, dates, and times of the incidents he had documented. Lisa listened carefully, occasionally taking notes. This is concerning, she admitted. I'll need to escalate this to senior management. In the meantime, I encourage you to keep documenting anything you notice. James left the meeting feeling a mix of hope and frustration. Progress was being made, but it was slow, and the weight of proving something that seemed so obvious was exhausting. Later that week, an unexpected ally emerged. A junior employee in the security department, who had overheard conversations about James's concerns, approached him discreetly. I've noticed what's been happening in the parking lot, the employee said. And you're right. The enforcement isn't random. Certain vehicles are flagged, and I don't think it's fair. James's heart raced. Do you know why? He asked. The employee hesitated before replying. I think it's coming from higher up. They don't say it outright, but there's definitely a bias in how things are handled. This confirmation solidified James's resolve. It wasn't just about parking tickets anymore, it was about addressing the deeper issue of systemic bias within the company. Word of James's parking lot investigation spread quickly through the office, sparking quiet but intense conversations. Employees who had previously dismissed the parking tickets as minor annoyances now began to reflect on their own experiences. What started as James's personal frustration was quickly evolving into a collective call for accountability. Rachel, the senior analyst who had already shown her support, decided to help James organize his findings into a presentation. You need to make this undeniable, she said. When you show them the patterns, they won't be able to brush it off as a coincidence. Together, they spent hours combing through James's photos, notes, and emails. Rachel added her own testimony, detailing instances where she had felt unfairly treated in other aspects of her work. As more employees learned about James's findings, others began to share their own stories. A junior accountant named Priya approached James one morning. "I heard about the parking tickets," she said hesitantly. "Something similar happened to me last year. I reported it, but they just told me to move on. I didn't think anyone cared enough to do anything about it." James smiled reassuringly. "We care," he said. "And the more people who come forward, the harder it will be for them to ignore us." Rachel suggested hosting a small, informal meeting to bring together employees who had experienced similar issues. They booked a conference room during lunch, unsure how many people would actually show up. To their surprise, the room was packed. People stood along the walls, balancing sandwiches and coffee cups as they listened intently to James explain his findings. "It's not just about parking tickets," James said, addressing the group. "It's about fairness. If something as simple as parking policies can be applied inconsistently, what does that say about how other rules and decisions are made here?" Heads nodded around the room, and murmurs of agreement filled the air. Rachel stepped forward, holding up a printed copy of the company's code of conduct. "This document talks about inclusivity and respect," she said. "But those words don't mean anything if the actions don't match." The room erupted in applause. As the meeting progressed, employees began sharing their own experiences. A warehouse supervisor named Marcus described how he was passed over for a promotion despite being more qualified than the person who got the job. "They told me I didn't fit the image they were looking for," he said bitterly. Priya recounted how she was reprimanded for a minor error on a report, while her coworker, who had made the same mistake, wasn't even spoken to. The stories painted a clear picture. The parking lot tickets were just the tip of the iceberg. James and Rachel decided to formalize their efforts, creating a document titled Voices of Continental that compiled the testimonies of employees. They kept it anonymous to protect contributors, but the impact was undeniable. Rachel reached out to a contact in the company's legal department to ask for advice. "If we take this to HR, how do we make sure they take it seriously?" she asked. The lawyer, speaking off the record, offered a crucial suggestion: frame it as a systemic issue, not just a collection of individual complaints. They'll be more likely to act if they see it as a liability. With Rachel's help, James prepared a formal request for a meeting with the company's leadership. The request was signed by dozens of employees, each one standing in solidarity with James. When they submitted the request, the head of HR replied within hours. "We'll schedule a meeting with senior leadership next week," the email read. "We take these concerns very seriously and are committed to addressing them." Rachel raised an eyebrow when she read the email. "Let's hope they mean it," she said. In the days leading up to the meeting, James felt a mix of nerves and determination. He knew that this was bigger than him now. The voices of his colleagues, the evidence they had gathered, and the momentum they had built all pointed to one undeniable truth: change was necessary. "This is our chance," Rachel said during one of their late-night strategy sessions. "We're not just asking for better parking policies. We're asking for accountability, for fairness, and for respect." James nodded. "And we won't stop until we get it." The meeting room felt larger than usual as James and his colleagues filed in, their collective determination filling the space. The table was lined with members of the company's senior leadership, including the CEO, Mark Donovan, the head of HR, and several department managers. James took a deep breath, clutching the folder containing the compiled evidence of parking policy inconsistencies and employee testimonies. This wasn't just about him anymore. This was about fairness for everyone in the company. Mark Donovan began the meeting with his usual polished tone. "Thank you all for bringing your concerns to our attention," he said. "We pride ourselves on being a company that values inclusivity and fairness, so it's important that we address any issues openly." James exchanged a glance with Rachel, who gave him a reassuring nod. "Thank you, Mr. Donovan," James replied. We appreciate the opportunity to speak today. But I think it's important to clarify that this isn't just about one or two isolated incidents. What we've uncovered points to a larger, systemic issue. The room grew quieter as James began his presentation. James started with the parking lot issue. He displayed photos on a projector screen, showing cars parked in unmarked spaces without tickets juxtaposed with photos of his own car ticketed multiple times. He highlighted patterns, pointing out how enforcement appeared to target specific individuals while leaving others unaffected. These aren't just random occurrences, James said. The data shows clear inconsistencies in how policies are applied. Rachel then took over, presenting excerpts from the anonymous testimonies compiled in the Voices of Continental document. Each story added weight to their case, painting a picture of bias that extended beyond the parking lot and into promotions, disciplinary actions, and everyday interactions. Employees are noticing these patterns, Rachel said. And it's creating an environment where many feel undervalued and unfairly treated. Mark Donovan leaned back in his chair, his face betraying a mix of surprise and discomfort. These are serious allegations, he said. But we need to ensure we're looking at this objectively. Are we certain this isn't a matter of miscommunication or isolated incidents? Rachel didn't hesitate. With all due respect, Mr. Donovan, the evidence speaks for itself. These aren't isolated incidents, they're part of a broader issue. Another senior manager chimed in, his tone skeptical. Bias is a strong word. Are we sure this isn't just a matter of perception? James took a deep breath before responding. Perception matters, he said. If employees perceive that they're being treated unfairly, that's already a problem. But in this case, the perception aligns with the evidence. Ignoring it would only exacerbate the issue. As the discussion continued, some members of the leadership team began to shift their stance. Laura, the middle manager who had offered her support earlier, spoke up. I've reviewed the testimonies, and I have to admit, it's hard to argue with what's being presented here, she said. This isn't just about policy enforcement, it's about creating a workplace where everyone feels valued. Her words seemed to resonate with others at the table. The head of HR, Lisa, nodded thoughtfully. I think it's clear that we need to take a closer look at our policies and practices, she said. This isn't something we can afford to ignore. Mark Donovan, sensing the growing consensus, leaned forward. All right, he said. Here's what we're going to do. We'll launch a full review of our parking policies and enforcement practices. But more importantly, we'll conduct a broader assessment of our workplace culture, including bias training for all employees. Rachel raised an eyebrow. And how do we ensure this isn't just a box-ticking exercise, she asked. Donovan met her gaze. We'll form a committee to oversee the process, he said. And I'd like both of you, he gestured to James and Rachel, to be part of it. Your insights have been invaluable, and I think you can help us drive real change. James felt a surge of relief mixed with determination. Thank you, he said. But this is just the beginning. It's going to take more than policies and training to rebuild trust. It's going to take consistent action. The tension in the room began to ease as the meeting drew to a close. Employees who had accompanied James and Rachel expressed their support for the proposed changes, while members of the leadership team pledged their commitment to making the workplace more inclusive. As James gathered his materials, Donovan approached him. I appreciate how you've handled this, he said. It's not easy to bring these kinds of issues to light, but you've done it with professionalism and grace. James nodded. I just want to make this a better place for everyone, he said simply. Word of the meeting spread quickly throughout the company. Employees who had been skeptical at first began to see the value in James's efforts, and many expressed their gratitude for his courage. For James, the meeting was a victory, but he knew it was just the first step. As he left the room that day, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. The real work was just beginning. The weeks following the meeting with leadership were transformative for Continental Enterprises. The parking lot, once a symbol of frustration and unfairness, now became the starting point for a broader conversation about accountability, inclusion, and respect. For James, the shift was both a relief and a new challenge. While he felt vindicated by the actions promised by leadership, he knew that real change required more than words. It needed follow-through, commitment, and most importantly, the willingness of everyone in the organization to reflect and adapt. True to their word, the leadership team quickly rolled out changes, beginning with the parking policies. Clear signage was installed to designate restricted spaces, and employees were provided with a detailed map outlining where they could and couldn't park. Security staff were retrained, with an emphasis on consistent and fair enforcement of all policies. James noticed the changes immediately. Gone were the orange tickets targeting specific vehicles. Instead, the parking lot operated with newfound order and fairness. But the parking issue was only the tip of the iceberg. The leadership committee, now including James and Rachel, began addressing deeper systemic issues within the company. One of the first major initiatives was a company-wide bias training program. At first, many employees approached it with skepticism. Another corporate workshop, someone muttered during the first session. But the program was different. Instead of relying on generic platitudes, it encouraged employees to reflect on their own biases and how they could influence workplace interactions. The sessions included real stories from employees, anonymized but powerful. During one session, James shared his experience with the parking tickets. "What stood out to me wasn't just the tickets themselves," he said. "It was the feeling of being singled out, of being treated differently for reasons that had nothing to do with my actions. That's what we're here to address, not just policies, but perceptions." His words resonated deeply, prompting several employees to open up about their own experiences. As the training sessions continued, James began to notice subtle but meaningful changes in the workplace culture. Colleagues who had once seemed indifferent now made an effort to engage more inclusively. Managers became more transparent in their decision-making, and employees started speaking up about issues they previously might have ignored. Rachel, ever the realist, pointed out the work still to be done. "This is a great start," she told James during a committee meeting. "But we can't let up. Change takes time, and it's easy for people to slip back into old habits." James nodded. "That's why we need to keep the momentum going," he said. "This isn't about one big victory, it's about building something sustainable." One day, during a routine committee meeting, Mark Donovan, the CEO, surprised James with a personal gesture. "I've been doing a lot of thinking since our initial meeting," Donovan said. "Your courage to bring these issues to light has made me reflect on my own leadership. I want you to know that your work here matters, not just to this company, but to me personally." James was momentarily taken aback, but quickly recovered. "Thank you, Mr. Donovan," he said. "I appreciate that. But I also know this isn't about me, it's about everyone who works here feeling valued and respected." Donovan smiled. "That's exactly the kind of leadership we need more of," he said. Over time, the tangible changes became evident. Employees felt more comfortable voicing their concerns, knowing they would be heard. Departments began hosting monthly town hall meetings to encourage open dialogue. One day, Priya, the junior accountant who had initially shared her story with James, approached him in the break room. "You know," she said, "I used to think speaking up wouldn't make a difference. But seeing what you've accomplished has changed my perspective. Thank you for fighting for all of us." James smiled. "It wasn't just me," he said. "It was everyone who stood up and said, 'This isn't right.' That's how change happens." The final step in the committee's plan was to implement a system for ongoing accountability. This included quarterly reviews of company policies, anonymous employee surveys, and regular updates from the Inclusion Committee. During one of the reviews, James noticed something remarkable. The number of reported incidents related to bias and unfair treatment had decreased significantly. The company wasn't perfect, but it was undeniably moving in the right direction. Months after the initial parking ticket incident, James stood in the now well-organized parking lot, looking at the clear signage and neatly parked cars. What had started as a frustrating morning had grown into a movement that reshaped the company's culture. Rachel joined him, holding 2 cups of coffee. "You did it," she said, handing him one. "We did it," James corrected, smiling. As they walked back into the building, James felt a deep sense of pride. The road to change had been long and challenging, but it was worth every step. The company rolled out a series of initiatives, including bias training for security staff, transparent parking policies, and the formation of an inclusion committee to address systemic issues. James was invited to join the committee, where his voice became instrumental in shaping the company's new direction. "It's not about the parking lot," James said during one meeting. "It's about making sure no one feels like they're less than anyone else, no matter where they come from or what they look like." Months later, the company's culture had noticeably shifted. Employees reported feeling more valued and included, and the changes in policy were seen as a step in the right direction. For James, the journey wasn't just about fighting for fairness, it was about proving that even small acts of courage could lead to meaningful change. As he parked his car in the now clearly marked employee lot, he couldn't help but smile. The bright orange tickets were gone, replaced by a renewed sense of equality and accountability. What began as a single parking ticket evolved into a powerful movement for change within Continental Enterprises. James's courage to question unfair practices and rally his colleagues brought systemic issues to light, paving the way for a more inclusive and equitable workplace. Through open dialogue, collective action, and leadership's commitment to improvement, the company transformed its culture, proving that even small acts of accountability can lead to significant progress. For James, the journey was a reminder that standing up for what's right isn't always easy, but it's always worth it. The parking lot, once a symbol of frustration, now stood as a testament to the power of persistence, unity, and the belief that fairness should never be optional.